It never made landfall, and yet Hawaii is dealing with damage as severe as if it had. Hurricane Lala skirted past the Big Island's southern coast this past weekend, close enough to unleash catastrophic flooding, tear apart roads and bridges, and knock out power to more than 200,000 homes and businesses, all without ever making a direct hit on land. By the time the storm weakened into a tropical storm, it had already dumped close to 3 feet of rain in some areas, swept more than 100 homes off their foundations, and left an entire town completely cut off from the outside world. Tonight, we're going to walk through exactly what happened, how bad the damage really is, what officials are doing about it, and what residents can expect in the days ahead. Let's start with how this storm came together in the first place. Lala first organized into a tropical storm early on Thursday, forming out in the ocean to the southeast of the Hawaiian Islands. Over the following 2 days, it slowly gathered strength as it moved closer, feeding off water that was significantly warmer than normal for this part of the Pacific. By early Saturday morning, it had strengthened into a full Category 1 hurricane, with sustained winds reaching 75 miles per hour. That was enough for the National Hurricane Center to issue a hurricane warning for Hawaii County, which covers the Big Island. To put that in perspective, this was the first time a hurricane watch or warning had been issued for the island since Hurricane Douglas back in 2020, and the Big Island itself has not taken a direct hurricane landfall in over 150 years. That streak held once again this weekend, but only barely, because Lala's eye wall came close enough to the coastline that the island still experienced hurricane-force conditions without the storm's center ever actually crossing onto land. As Saturday went on, the storm's closest approach brought sustained winds of around 75 to 80 miles per hour to parts of the Big Island, with even stronger gusts reported in exposed areas. But the wind, as damaging as it was, ended up being only part of the story. The bigger danger by far turned out to be the rain. Forecasters had already warned that some areas could see up to 3 feet of rainfall, and in several locations that prediction turned out to be almost exactly right. The town of Lapahoe on the Big Island recorded more than 42 inches of rain. Other high-elevation spots, including areas near Mauna Kea, saw rainfall totals above 35 inches. At the peak of the storm, rain was falling at a rate of 2 to 5 inches every single hour in some communities, which is an extraordinary amount of water in an extremely short window of time. Even on Maui, which was farther from the storm's path, one location recorded more than 23 inches of rain. Officials described the flooding that resulted as a life-threatening, particularly dangerous situation and urged anyone in low-lying areas to move to higher ground immediately. That flooding hit hardest in the southern part of the Big Island, in a region known as the Ka District. Local officials say that as floodwaters rose on Saturday evening, at least 2 homes in Neolihu were completely swept off their foundations and carried away by the rushing water. In one especially dramatic rescue, an elderly woman was swept away along with her own house when the floodwaters hit. Fire officials say she was carried roughly 100 yards by the current before rescuers were able to reach her. She was found the following morning, conscious and alert, but with moderate injuries, and was taken by ground ambulance to the hospital. In a separate incident, 2 rescue personnel who were trying to help another resident found themselves in trouble when rising water pushed their ambulance into a guardrail. They were able to escape onto the vehicle's roof, and the Hawaii National Guard, who were already on the ground supporting the response, helped get them safely out of the area. By Sunday, Hawaii's governor confirmed that more than 100 homes across the Big Island had been either damaged or completely destroyed by the flooding. Local fire departments say they fielded hundreds of storm-related calls within just the first day, including well over 100 reports of trees that had come down, many of them landing directly on power lines. Roofs were torn off buildings in several communities, and in Punaluu, a bakery that serves as one of the area's larger employers and a well-known stop for visitors, took a direct hit when floodwaters tore through its factory and retail store, leaving behind several feet of mud once the water finally receded. Now let's talk about what is probably the single most dramatic piece of damage from this entire storm, and that's what happened in the town of Pāhala. Pāhala is a community of roughly 2,500 people, and it is home to the region's only hospital. On Saturday night, around 9 o'clock, residents there described hearing a loud roar, followed almost immediately by a sudden explosive rush of water. A nearby stream had swollen so much from the rain that it burst directly through a rock retaining wall along the highway. That retaining wall, which runs right in front of the local hospital, visibly shifted and snapped in two under the pressure. Moments later, the highway itself gave way, collapsing into the floodwaters below and effectively creating a brand new waterfall where a road used to be. When county officials flew over the area the next day to assess the damage, they counted 6 separate bridges in the region that were either completely destroyed or so badly damaged they can no longer be safely used. Because of that collapse, Pāhala has been left almost entirely isolated, with its main road access cut off and its hospital now extremely difficult to reach by vehicle. Officials have said openly that repairing this kind of damage, especially the transmission infrastructure and the highway itself, is going to be an enormous financial undertaking and is likely to take a significant amount of time, not days. Power has been one of the biggest ongoing struggles throughout this entire event. As the storm moved across the islands, outage numbers climbed steadily. At the height of the storm, more than 200,000 customers across the state were left without electricity, with the Big Island accounting for a large share of that total. The local utility company says it is bringing in hundreds of additional workers, some of them flown in specifically to help the Big Island, to begin repairing damaged lines. But officials have been upfront that this repair work is complicated by the fact that many of the downed lines are major transmission lines rather than simple neighborhood power lines, and those take considerably longer to fix. At least 3 hospitals across the islands were forced to switch over to generator power at the height of the storm in order to keep operating. As of the latest update, officials say they do not believe anyone died as a direct result of the flooding or the storm's winds. There was one fatal car accident on the Big Island that occurred as the storm was making its closest approach. But officials say it remains under investigation whether that crash was actually connected to the weather conditions or was unrelated. The emergency response to all of this has been substantial. Close to 200 members of the Hawaii National Guard were deployed to support search and rescue operations, working alongside county civil defense teams and the Coast Guard. Emergency shelters were opened across the Big Island, and by the height of the storm, more than 100 people had taken refuge in them. In hard-hit Pāhala specifically, shelters set up at 2 locations were housing dozens of displaced residents whose homes had been flooded out. The governor has already begun the formal process of declaring this a major disaster, which would open the door to additional federal assistance for the recovery effort. He has also ordered all state and county offices, public schools, and courts across Hawaii to remain closed as cleanup and safety assessments continue. While the Big Island bore the worst of the physical destruction, it wasn't the only place affected. As Lala continued moving northwest through the weekend, its outer bands brought strong winds and heavy rain across Maui, Oahu, and Kauai as well. On Oahu, the damage was driven mostly by wind rather than flooding, with fallen trees reported around the island, including large trees that had to be cleared from public spaces in Honolulu. Officials on Oahu opened multiple emergency refuge shelters as a precaution and closed public facilities like the Honolulu Zoo while the storm passed through. Large ocean swells generated by the storm also created dangerous surf and rip current conditions along many of the island's coastlines, and officials warned that those hazardous ocean conditions were expected to linger for a few days even after the rain moved on. So why did this storm behave the way it did, staying so strong for so long, so close to Hawaii? Normally, tropical systems approaching the islands weaken fairly quickly because they run into cooler ocean water the closer they get. This time, that didn't happen the way it usually does. An ongoing marine heat wave has left large stretches of the Pacific, including the waters around Hawaii, significantly warmer than average. On top of that, a developing El Niño pattern has been reducing the kind of upper atmosphere wind shear that normally helps tear storms apart as they approach. Together, those 2 factors allowed Lala to stay over unusually warm water for longer than storms in this region typically do, which is a big part of why it was able to reach hurricane strength so close to the islands and hold on to that strength for as long as it did. As of the most recent advisory, the storm center was sitting roughly 140 miles west of Honolulu, with sustained winds down to 65 miles per hour, just below hurricane strength, and moving away from the islands at about 16 miles per hour. Forecasters say they don't expect much change in the storm's strength over the next day or so, but they are watching closely because there is a real possibility that Lala could strengthen back into a hurricane again by the middle of this week, once it has moved well clear of Hawaii and out over open ocean. For the islands themselves, though, forecasters say the immediate flood threat is easing, even as a few more inches of rain are still possible from the storm's trailing bands. It's also worth putting this storm into some broader context. This is happening just 3 years after Hawaii endured the deadliest wildfire disaster the United States has seen in more than a century, and only a few months after residents on Oahu's North Shore weathered a separate, unrelated round of severe storms earlier this year. For a lot of people across the islands, the anxiety of watching this storm approach felt painfully familiar, even though the damage this time told its own very different story. Several residents interviewed in the hardest hit areas described the same theme over and over: a community used to disaster and used to leaning on each other to get through it. Officials echoed that same sentiment, describing the Big Island as a resilient, tightly connected community where neighbors have a long history of stepping in to help neighbors dig out, rebuild, and get back on their feet. Right now, the recovery effort is really just beginning. Crews are working to restore power to the hundreds of thousands of customers still in the dark. Engineers are assessing whether the collapsed sections of highway near Pāhala can be temporarily repaired to reconnect that isolated community, or whether a longer-term rebuild will be needed. Search and rescue teams are continuing to check on residents in the hardest hit, hardest to reach areas to make sure everyone is accounted for. That's where things stand for now. We'll continue to bring you updates as power is restored, as road access improves, and as officials release more information on the total cost of the damage and the timeline for rebuilding.